That's carried. Thank you. Item 24, the draft submission on the Kainga Ora-Homes and Communities Bill. And Paul, perfect time to make an entry. Good to have you with us. Were there any comments that you wanted to make on this matter before we ask any questions?
Where are we? No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've attempted a perfectly timed run chase, unlike the Indian team last night. So, thank you. I'll just pull out my eyes. So, thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll obviously take the covering report and the submission as read, but just to briefly remind you of 3 key points on it. So, Council, we're recommending that Council submission supports the Bill's objectives around affordable housing and the associated well-beings with it around housing and urban development. Our submission emphasises taking account of 3 matters when doing so, when the Kainga Ora, the Crown entity, is in operation. So these are things around local engagement and decision-making, treating housing as a human right and giving some operational effect to that in the government policy statement part of the bill, and taking account of the local context, so the local planning strategies and documents, for example, the Our Space one that you considered before lunch. So we explicitly reference that in the Council submission. So you'll see that the submission is constructed around a narrative for a start, so trying to tell a story around those 3 things, Mr. Chair. And then we have some recommendations on the clauses of the bill, structured under the proposed board of the bill, its function, its principles, and the government policy statement. So just again to remind you that this bill essentially is setting up the Crown entity, and the legislation that talks about the powers that the Crown entity will have is anticipated to come sometime later in the year. But I guess as a prelude to that, just lately the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development have been talking to us about carrying out some engagement and discussion with likely partners and communities ahead of that second tranche of legislation being introduced. So in other words, a bit of discussion around working out how we're going to engage with you, how we're going to partner with you, how we're going to work with you in the first instance, which we imagine will help inform that second bill when it comes, Mr. Chair, if that's some helpful context for you.
Thank you. Questions? Glenn.
Thank you. As you know, there's concern at the moment, Paul, over intensification in some parts of the city. It's not so much intensification per se, but it's the way it's being delivered. What can you see in this part of the UDA, if it's applied to a local level, that will enable better process over that when it comes to, e.g. notification with the community?
Sure. I guess at a first principles level, if we're thinking about how it might operate in a housing space, and our submission also notes that the rest of the urban development that occurs should be ancillary to affordable housing development. So if we think about affordable housing as its primary focus, so if it operates in an area, say as it's done in other parts of the country, on the likes of your Tamakis, what's proposed at Porirua, and what's likely to be some cabs off the rank in Christchurch, if you think about some of the Housing New Zealand estates where council also owns some land. If you think about how it might upzone some of that land to create perhaps some high density type housing. So our submission again refers to, well, we want you to have a localism type principle approach here in terms of how you take account of our local planning documents, just defining and spelling out good quality a bit more. So it's rather loosely defined at the moment, so we're asking them to define that a bit more and to take into account good urban amenity and design in the whole process. So it may not specifically answer your concerns, but it's at a principles levels, and on that basis that's how we're pitching the submission for you when we engage with Kainga Ora.
And just clarifying, this is over public housing, but we've also had some issues there with some developments over, whether or not the community's been taken on board.
Yes, quite correct. And I would think the Ministry is very keen to learn from what's happened in Glen Innes and Tamaki. about how to do things a lot better and in a more engaged way. And certainly when we think about trying to minimise the risk for the potential social dislocation when you move families out while some housing is being redeveloped and then they're moving back in. So we would like to think we'll be pretty hot on that, on stressing that side of the equation too.
Aaron.
Yeah, just a couple of questions, because you can spend a lot of money setting up, more layers of bureaucracy and stuff through Wellington, and then what are the deliverable outcomes? And also, when it says affordable housing, what's the definition being used here?
The bill doesn't define it. As I say,
Is that not a risk in itself?
I'll come to that,
Yep.
if you will. So we're making a recommendation that one of the clauses is changed to ensure that affordable housing remains so. So if you think about the typical definition of affordable housing, so households pay no more than 30% of their income on housing costs, we think that's the intent of it. We would suggest better places to flesh those sorts of things out, and a number of other matters if you're thinking about, for example, affordable housing requirements that you might want to see in developments is in the government policy statement on housing. So that'll set the direction, it'll be reviewed every 3 years, so it'll set the direction for the government's priorities around housing and urban development. So we would think that's the place to go into that more fully in a similar way that the GPS on transport does,
Yep.
Mr Falconer.
That's right, yep.
Thank you. Any further? Phil?
Thank you, Paul. And I was reading this last night and I might have missed it, but just in terms of the government setting up such an authority, how are we commenting on how we can ensure that, in fact, they don't override, local people's rights?
Yes, so we specifically note that, as I said, around the council's plans and policies and strategies developed, like the outspace. Local rights, if you're thinking about probably how I've touched on how people can remain in their communities and return in their communities, so that's something I would think that we're going to have to flesh out with them on the partnering and engaging and decision making. So as I say, they've alluded to that they want to have those conversations with us before the second tranche of legislation around the powers. So that's probably the place to try and enshrine that a bit more, and perhaps the government policy statement offers another vehicle, or electric vehicle of course, in which to entrench that a bit further.
Or if it's a typo, if you can, there's conceiving of housing as a merit good.
Yes.
Just what that term meant.
Oh, right. So just in terms of how we discuss and frame up housing. So housing is a private good in many respects. It's key to wealth and the personal security in old age. But if we're thinking it more broadly in terms around of community infrastructure, if we think about it like that, and a merit good of how it has more public benefits, and then I think that allows us to frame it up and think about other ways of how to tackle housing issues and a more fuller range of solutions to it, how we best use our public resources for affordable housing outcomes for our households. That's really what it's getting there, to move away from the sole market focus on trying to address the problem, because market-only solutions haven't worked so well to date in some of these areas.
Thank you. Any further questions? Vicky?
This sets up, as I read it, an urban development authority at a central government level as part of the housing authority. And then there is a major gap of would those be required at local level. And my read of it is, and I may be completely wrong, so I'd like your view on it, is that there won't be local urban development authorities. There will likely be a national one. And if that's the case, then that changes our whole view on the whole future urban development possibilities around Christchurch.
That's certainly the indication we're having at this stage as well, that it is a Crown entity, so that will have some advantages and disadvantages associated with that.
So the concept of worrying about the future of regeneration because of Regenerate Christchurch, because of the urban development powers it has, becomes an academic exercise, potentially.
That's probably a fair reading of it, yes. did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first tranche of legislation. They are saying there'll be a second tranche. Now that may include more local UDAs.
They're unclear on that, though, aren't they?
But they're not clear on that. So this is all we've got at the moment. But there could be something in the future.
You wouldn't need it, though, if you had a national one.
Just following on from that, presumably there are a number of questions that a council or a territorial authority would decide to set up a UDA, not only because of the ability for it to have powers delegated to it from the national UDA, and noting the comment in your report, you're agnostic on what might happen in that second tranche of legislation. You're certainly not, as I read it, raising an issue that there won't be the opportunity for powers to be delegated to local UDAs or, in fact, territorial authorities or other local bodies. You're just saying there's no mention of it. You're not raising an expectation that there will not be the ability for that type of delegation, nor have I read that incorrectly?
No, that's right. There's no mention of it. We can't.
Yeah.
Absolutely no mention of it. As recently as a meeting yesterday in Wellington with community housing providers, the chief executive of the ministry turned up and he made absolutely no mention of localised urban development authorities. His sole focus is on setting this one up and having dialogue with potential partners around the country before the second tranche is introduced. So that's clearly the page they appear to be on.
All right, we'll watch the development of the second tranche with interest in that case.
Will
Thank
happen.
you.
We will advise you. Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions? All right. Do we have a mover for this recommendation, for this resolution? Glenn, seconded by Phil. Is there any debate? Glenn.
Okay, thank you. There are two main aspects to this as per the submission, being a public housing landlord and being a UDA. We know that demand for housing is huge, and people like Shamu Biola-Cube talks about New Zealand flatlining over public housing delivery in 1991 and also over affordable housing at the same time, and successive governments haven't grasped the nettle over that or realised, and now we're trying to play catch up, and New Zealand has real issues. So there's no problem there over the delivery of public housing. We need to give it all we can. Over the UDA side of it, which has taken up most of our discussion, we're acutely aware as a TA here of being overridden, and so that's possibly of as much interest to us as the actual housing. I guess my conclusion with what I've seen over the degrading resource consent notification process over the last 9 or 10 years, processes speed. We've all seen developments publicly shoot up in our communities where the community's been cut out of the equation. In one instance, they had to scrap the plans and it cost a lot of money and had to start again because they didn't take the people with them. So processes speed. If we're going to have a UDA, make it local, but you've got to front load it. Okay, well, maybe it'll come out in the second tranche, but take the community with you, or it will just be an almighty mess.
Dion.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's an interesting time around housing and whatnot in New Zealand, and we've got a growing population, but we've also got a rapidly ageing population as well. So, I mean, this is, it's interesting and it's good to get this submission through. But yeah, there is some concern around having a national UDA, because it basically, if you look at the powers that a national UDA are going to have, is basically come in and they can change your district plan pretty much like what we had under the SERA Act or the SEA Act, and a whole lot of things. And it could potentially override that localism conversation that we're having. So we need to be really conversing with the Crown around this, because we are seeing perversive effects of what happens when you do those kind of things, and we're seeing them in our communities at the moment. But there is the opportunity through the coming RMA changes to the the changes that the Crown want to make to the RMA, and I look forward to seeing what they propose and getting involved in that process, because I think that will make the biggest changes to helping our communities get some of the outcomes that they want.
Thank you. Yanni.
Yeah, I strongly endorse this submission. I think it covers some really important points. I mean, the irony here, of course, is that government, while refusing to enable councils to access income-related rents for our own city housing, are exempting themselves from paying development contributions to contribute to the growth in the areas where they're expanding their housing. So I think that's a really important point that we've made. You know, areas that have had a huge influx of social housing have had virtually no increase in amenity to deal with that growth. And I think it's outrageous that the government would try and exempt themselves from contributing to the community and the amenity of an area when they're building housing developments. The second point I think is really, really important in our submission, and that is it's basically paragraph 15 that says, in terms of local democracy, the Greater Christchurch context, there's growing disquiet over the inefficiency and confusion of having multiple regeneration agencies with urban planning and development functions. And, you know, the sooner we get, you know, the regeneration ecosystem sorted out with simplicity and actually, you know, just take the footbridge as a classic example of the utter confusion that people have over who's responsible and who makes decisions, I think the better will be. So let's hope that if this does get set up, then we can have some very good clarity over the need to actually get rid of duplication and inefficient other agencies that exist in our city. But, you know, I support the focus on housing. It needs to be done with community. And just coming back from the LGNZ conference, I think one of the really interesting points will be those RMA changes that have been touched on, and about whether the RMA process enables communities to participate, or whether it's seen as even further weakening the ability for people to be notified and the need for consenting. And I think that would be a real shame if it happened, but that's going to be the stage 2, I guess, as part of this, or it's going to be a separate process. But fundamentally focusing on housing, having the government actually do some development, I think is a sensible thing, but we just need to remove the duplication and need to ensure that they're paying for the true cost of that development rather than putting an extra burden on us as a city.
As we know well in Christchurch, having a central government agency involved in what are really local planning decisions in a top-down way can produce any number of unintended outcomes and outcomes that are not supported by communities. I think this is a good submission that picks up those issues. Locally driven partnerships, recognition of existing local communities, realising that there's some decision making that really needs to be driven from the local level, regardless of which entity has the responsibility to make decisions, really is a part of that localism debate that Yanni referred to. And of course, in Christchurch, we've been very familiar with some of this through the Earthquake Recovery Act, through the Regeneration Act, through the District Plan Review and the Independent Hearings Panel. And I'm certainly aware that the Christchurch experience has formed and needs to form part of the decision making about what a national UDA would look like, because there are certain things that have happened here that probably wouldn't be seen as good examples of ways that you would want to do things elsewhere. So it's the danger of top-down decision making processes because of having a national body without the opportunity for genuine local input, genuine local engagement, genuine local influence on decisions or local decision making. So I welcome this submission in as much as it picks up those points. When we get into stage 2 of the development of the legislation around this, certainly it would be my view that we would want to support the ability for powers that are held by the national UDA to be able to be delegated in some shape or form to a local entity, whether that was a local UDA or whether that was a local council. And of course, in recent developments with Regenerate Christchurch, we've sent a very strong signal around consolidation, We've sent a very strong signal around the next phase of Regenerate Christchurch bin, moving to the end of Regenerate Christchurch and defining what that end point looks like. And we've done that obviously through the letter of expectation that was recently issued, and we've sent a very strong signal through the new board appointments that we made. So this is timely for Christchurch. But it's also timely for us to reflect on where we've been and what we might want the future to look like in the context of the new entity that we're discussing with regards to this report. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye.